You know, when we think of stories from the First World War, our minds usually go to tales of loss, of futility, the tragedy of a generation just sent to die. But Ernst Jünger's memoir Storm of Steel is something else entirely. It's not an anti-war story in the way we typically think of them. Nope. Instead, it's this visceral, unflinching plunge right into the experience of combat. The terror, the exhaustion, and, maybe most controversially, the strange, exhilarating intensity of it all. To really get our heads around this, we've got to start before the war even began.
This quote right here, it just nails the mindset before the first shot was even fired. Jünger's generation, see, they grew up in this long period of peace. He called it a material age, an era of bourgeois comfort and safety that they found totally stifling. They had this deep craving for something abnormal, for a great experience that would push them to their absolute limits. And war, in their imagination, well, that promised to be the ultimate experience, a way to escape the ordinary and find something profound, even if it was terrifying.
So, the journey begins right here, with this incredibly powerful allure of war. You've got a whole generation just intoxicated by a dream of greatness, a dream fueled by a century of romantic stories and nationalist fervor. Long before the reality of mud and steel set in, this powerful idea was pulling young men right out of their classrooms and lecture halls, sending them marching full of enthusiasm straight for the front.
I mean, just imagine it. These weren't conscripts being dragged off to fight. These were volunteers who saw war as their destiny. Jünger writes that the war had entered into us like wine. It was seen as a man's work, right? A glorious duel on a historic stage where you could find a death that was far lovelier, far more meaningful than any long life you could live by just staying home. This was the potent, powerful illusion that kicked the whole thing off. And then, bam, reality hits. The very first encounter with war wasn't some noble enemy on a blood-stained field. No, it was the sight of a figure just streaming with blood, limbs hanging loose, being carried away on a stretcher. And in that one moment, Jünger realizes war isn't personal. It's not glorious. It's mysterious. It's impersonal. And it is brutally, horribly physical. The romantic dream is just instantly shattered by the raw, visceral horror of it all.
So that initial shock, it fades. And what's left is the soul-crushing grind of trench warfare. The glorious dangers they'd all dreamed of were completely replaced by a monotonous, exhausting reality that would test them in ways they could have never, ever imagined.
Yeah, this wasn't a life of heroic charges. It was a life of endless guard duty. We're talking maybe 2 hours of sleep a night, and that's if you were lucky. It was the misery of constant, penetrating rain that soaked through everything, leaving them shivering, their faces smeared with this chalky mud when the sun came up. And the nights, they weren't for sleeping. They were for backbreaking labor, digging trenches. Even the food was a source of misery. These desiccated vegetables were so disgusting they mockingly called them wire entanglements.
And where they lived, it was just awful. These weren't shelters, not really. There were just holes hacked into the chalk walls of the trench, constantly dripping in the rain. So what do? To cope, the soldiers developed this dark gallows humor, naming these wretched holes things like men's baths. Honestly, it was one of the only ways they could endure the squalor.
So, you see this huge gap, right? This chasm between what they expected and what they got. They signed up for glorious danger, for a test of courage in the heat of battle. What they got was inglorious hardship. The heroism that was actually required wasn't about facing the enemy head-on. It was about conquering mud and misery and sleepless nights, a kind of heroism, Jünger admits, that was little to our taste. But you know, that grind of trench life was punctuated by moments of absolutely unimaginable violence. So now we shift from that passive suffering to the active, terrifying chaos of battle. This is the crucible, where industrial warfare puts the soldier to the ultimate test.
When Jünger describes shelling, it's just so sensory. It's not just noise. He calls it a wild dance. The air is thick with this mingled smoke from different types of shells, a constant hundredfold clatter that feels like it's shaking the entire world apart. And yet, in the brief pauses, he noticed the birds in the shattered trees would just keep on singing. What a bizarre, surreal contrast between nature and utter destruction.
And this is probably one of the most powerful ways I've ever heard someone describe the pure psychological terror of being shelled. You are completely, utterly helpless. Every whistle, every shriek of metal is linked in your brain to the idea of imminent death.
It really is like watching that sledgehammer swing, missing you by inches again and again and again, knowing that the very next blow could be the last.
You gotta understand, combat wasn't always these long, drawn-out battles. Trench raids were sudden, they were brutally intimate, and they were over in minutes. Men would storm across no man's land for this fleeting, terrifying clash in the enemy trench, and for the few who made it back, the memory was just this: a frantic glimpse into the very furnace of war, a white-hot cauldron of destruction. And amidst all this almost poetic description of chaos, you get these cold, hard numbers. 40. That's how many men from his regiment were killed in a single morning. And this wasn't some major history book battle. This was just a minor English attack. It's a number that just grounds the whole experience in the brutal, mathematical reality of industrial-scale killing.
So for Jünger, the Battle of the Somme, that was the real turning point. It didn't just transform the soldiers, it transformed the very earth itself. He describes a landscape that was completely annihilated. No trees, no grass, just an endless sea of craters. He calls it a faithful picture of the soul of scientific war, a world literally remade by and for the machine.
So how do you survive in a world like that? Well, your mind adapts. Jünger describes this psychological transformation where soldiers, after being pushed through horror to the absolute limit of despair, they learn to despise it. And the result is this hardened, stoic indifference. It's not that they don't care, it's that they literally can't afford to. It becomes this brutal but absolutely necessary armor for the soul.
Okay, so this brings us to the final and honestly the most challenging part of Jünger's whole story. After being broken down by hardship and hammered in the crucible of combat, what is created? Who is this new man that emerges from these flames? You can actually trace this transformation, this evolution of the soldier. It starts with that idealistic volunteer back in 1914. Then, the Battle of the Somme acts as the forge, giving the war its unique, brutal character. Afterwards, the soldier is remade. You can see it symbolized by the steel helmet. He becomes almost a part of the war machine. His face is no longer soft and youthful. Its features are chiseled, marked by an energy that has been stretched to its absolute limit.
And this is where we get to Jünger's most famous and, most controversial conclusion. He doesn't dismiss the horror, not at all, but he sees a value in the struggle itself. For him, the war was a test that forged character, what he called a good and strenuous life. This idea that something so destructive could be an incomparable schooling of the heart is what truly sets his work apart. It's this embrace of struggle, this idea that you find true meaning not in comfort, but in overcoming immense adversity.
So you might be asking, why? Why would he call it a schooling? Because for Jünger, the immense suffering gave profound meaning to abstract concepts. The fatherland, this powerful idea of national identity and duty, it was no longer just a word from a speech. Having seen so many men die for it, having staked his own life for it minute by minute, the idea became real, distilled into a clearer and brighter essence by the very blood that was shed for it.
And that really brings us back to the central, unsettling question his memoir leaves us with. He presents a man who has looked straight into the abyss of industrial warfare, who has endured the unendurable and has been fundamentally changed by it. He's hardened, he's stoic, he's indifferent to death, and he's found a profound meaning in the very struggle that nearly destroyed him. And it leaves us to wonder, what kind of man really is forged in the storm of steel?